I think Ed and I go back at least 20 years. We were both on the Commission of Social Action of Reform Judaism. He was a lawyer at that time, and then he became a rabbi, and then he became a congregational rabbi, and now he's a representative in Montana State House of Representatives. And he's just a hell of a good friend. We don't see each other as much as we used to. So I think that's a little bit sad to me. But after he got elected, I don't know what caused me to. Oh, I know what it was. I called him because I didn't know how to get in touch with Alan from last night, and Ed gave me your cell phone number, and then we started schmoozing, and I said congratulations, and he started telling me all these wild tales of what he's doing right now. So Ed, just welcome to Greensboro, North Carolina, virtually, and welcome to everyone else. We are so blessed to have you tonight. And by the way, Ed was with us in Selma for the 50th Jewish celebration, 50th anniversary of the Bloody Sunday marches. But anyway, Ed, we're just delighted that you're here. You don't have to wear a tie if you don't want to. We're not in this is not as hostile audience like the House of Representatives. But anyway, it's all you. Thank you for spending time with us, and I throw the ball to you.
Well, thank you. What a great introduction. Pesach Sameach to everybody out there in North Carolina or wherever you are. I want to call out my good friend Raymond Capilouto, who back in my Tallahassee days, who preceded me there as the president of Temple Israel there, back when I was a much younger man. Fighting this legislature is kind of a younger man's sport too. It's exhausting. Days go for 14 hours very often, and at a pace like I've never seen anything in my life. So I'll talk for a few minutes, but then I'd really rather just let folks have questions. I'd love to answer them. I am the first progressive rabbi, as far as we know, to ever be elected to a state legislature, as far as we know in the history of the United States. There was an Orthodox rabbi who never served as a rabbi, but was ordained in New York, and apparently was quite a character because he ran as a Republican, but as a Democrat, but then he became a Republican while he was there in an evenly divided house. So he became the subject of much controversy. So I'm the first non-Orthodox rabbi and the first congregational rabbi ever to be elected. And I could say that when I was first elected, the first thing I wanted to do was pick a verse that would guide my journey. And I immediately came to the verse in Esther that you're all familiar with that says, who knows, but God has put you in this place just at this time because there's a task for you to do. But after I got here, I realized that was nothing but pure ego on my part, that I could actually accomplish anything. And now my verse actually comes from Pirkei Avot, from the sayings of the fathers, where it says, when you come to a place and there's no mensch there, be a mensch. And that's kind of my goal now, is to just try to be a human being in a place that's very, very cruel and very, very troubling in so many ways. Today we passed, just today, so I serve on two committees. I serve on the Judiciary Committee, which hears all the controversial bills, and I serve on the Health and Human Services Committee. Today's bills, there were 3 of them in Judiciary. Just to give you an idea, 2 of them were brought by anti-vaxxers who want to make it so that nobody can ask about your vaccination status. And so a preschool, for example, could not require any of the students to show the proof of vaccine. Neither could a regular school. We had, I'm going to say 40 or 50 health professionals, the head of the Academy of Pediatrics, every health official you could imagine in the world to come testify against that bill and why it's so dangerous. And on the other side or a bunch of people who I don't think passed high school science. If they did, I'd be surprised. They certainly didn't go much further. And they come in and spew all sorts of stuff about how vaccines are dangerous and we have a right, a God-given right not to get a vaccine and yada, yada, yada. And both of those passed on party line votes. The third one we heard would be to set up a commission of lay people that can overrule judges if they think the judges didn't do their job well in the case. That passed on a party line vote too. Now, they're both passed the Judiciary Committee, so now they'll go to the House floor, and they got to pass there, which they will. And then they have to go to the Senate, and then the governor has to sign them. So I don't know that they'll survive, but it's troubling. Then on the floor at 1 o'clock, I actually argued today against a bill that would be the first step towards Montana seceding from the Union. It's a bill that's a reaction to President Biden. And it says essentially that if that the Attorney General of Montana can review every executive order by President Biden, and if he doesn't agree that it's proper, he can declare that it can't be enforced in Montana. There's a legal name for that called nullification, and it was first tried by South Carolina in 1836. This is actually what I said on the House floor. There was a federal law that they didn't like, and they said, we're not going to enforce it. President Johnson at the time said, that's treason, and Congress threatened to send in the troops. It got tenser over the next few years, and finally South Carolina became the first state to secede from the Union. But it started with this notion of nullification. The notion of nullification was not used again until the 1950s. It was used by Alabama and Mississippi to try to prevent desegregation in the South. And the Supreme Court at that time called it a discredited and wholly discredited legal theory. But here we are in 2021 and it's back. And Montana is now, it passed the House, it's still got to, no, actually this was a Senate bill, so it's already passed both houses, it's going to go to the governor. I did manage to get 2 Republicans to vote with us. So I have to go back to this last election and how devastating it was. I'm not sure what happened in North Carolina, but here, the Trump effect just was a red wave in an otherwise purple state. So we had a Democratic governor, and one of our 2 U.S. senators are Democrats. The governor, who was very popular, ran for the other Senate seat, got beat badly. We lost every statewide office by a wide margin. All these low information Trump voters who'd never voted before came out and just voted Republican Party line. But what happened in the House of Representatives is there's 100 seats. We went from 42 seats to 33. And with 42, you can cobble together coalitions. With 33, not so much. So, you know, I look a lot to the words of Ruth Bader Ginsburg and the sages in the Talmud who talked about dissent and the value of dissent. And mostly a dissent. I did pass 2 bills. All my other bills failed. I never got out of committee. The 2 bills I passed, though, one was simply a resolution that praised our workers for the work in the pandemic. And the other one was a good bill. It actually creates a PPE stockpile, a rotating stockpile. So when we have the next emergency, we'll be better prepared. And that passed by just 2 votes. And it was hard work to get that passed. So what I thought I'd do with you is, I think what might be interesting for this group is how's my Jewishness and my status as a rabbi perhaps played out in the legislature. So I got 3 really short clips. So every day the House starts at 1 o'clock and it starts with a prayer, much like the United States Congress does, I guess. And but unlike there, these prayers are so Christian centric. It's not only Jesus, but like Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. And so I had an opportunity to do the prayer one day, and I'll share with you what that looked like. And then I've got a couple of floor arguments that I made that I can share. Tell me if you can see my screen. Can you see it?
We can see it.
Okay. Can you hear it?
Members and guests, please rise for the invocation by Representative Stafman and remain standing for the Pledge of Allegiance.
There I am with my talit.
So I'd like to share with you all today
You can enlarge it.
recorded blessing known. It's called the priestly blessing, and probably some of you are familiar with it. The setting is the desert where the Israelites built their very first tabernacle and all assembled there to consecrate it. And Aaron, the high priest at the time, came out and delivered this blessing. Just a word about the blessing. For the first line, which you probably all know, it says, "May God bless you and protect you." But the rabbis of the first century they thought that was odd, because they thought, bless you with what? And protect you with what? From what? And they figured out that since the blessing was in the singular you, but yet many people were being blessed, the blessing was whatever you needed. Even though the blessing is a group, each of us needs something different, and that's the blessing. The protecting is a little bit more troubling. They couldn't figure out protect you from what. And they realized it meant protect you from the blessing. So for example, if you need money, might you be blessed with money, but not so much that you lose your sense of generosity? If you need confidence, may you be blessed with confidence, but not so much so that you need to be protected from so much confidence that you become arrogant or demean the views of others. Last example, if you need freedom, may you be blessed with freedom, but also protected from so much freedom that you fail to see the responsibilities that you owe to others. And so the blessing goes like this. May God bless you and protect you. Ya'er Adonai panav elecha v'yichunecha. May God's light shine upon you and be gracious to you. Yisa Adonai panav elecha v'yasem lecha shalom. And may God's presence always be before you and bring you peace. And the people responded, Ken Yehi Ratzon, may it always be true. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United
So there you go. A little example of bringing a little Yiddishkeit into the legislature. And it was very deliberate, the examples I picked. So one of the themes, so you can't lecture these people because they have a very definite worldview. And if you try to upset their worldview, it gets you nowhere. And one of the pieces of their worldview is this belief in freedom. Freedom, freedom, freedom. We should be free to do whatever we want. You don't want to wear a mask? That's freedom. You don't want to get a vaccine? That's freedom. Everything is about freedom, but there's nothing about responsibility. And so if I were to try to work that into a prayer, it would just fall on deaf ears. But very subtly, you'll see what I did is I tried to balance freedom with just a hint of get them thinking maybe there's something about responsibility they have to think about too. But that idea that they're so kind of wedded to their ideology is something that's been fascinating to me to see. So the verse I should have picked was Daniel going into the lion's den because these people are a different breed of people than probably you've ever met. So two people on judiciary with me, we have a civil relationship. We don't agree on anything. And we've had all these bills that are very harshly anti-LGBT and anti-trans. And I asked each one of them the same question, and I got the same answer. And that is, what is it that makes you want to discriminate against LGBT people? And they looked, each of them said almost the same words at different times. You don't understand it, they said. these people are persecuted, and it's got in there thing I can say that will change their mind. They believe that just as much as you believe you're a Jew, which I assume most of you are. I don't know. That is a core belief. They believe that Christians, and if you do ask them, well, why? Where's that coming from? The first thing they all do is hold up the baker in Colorado, who they felt was being persecuted because the gay couple knew that he wouldn't bake a cake for them and pressed it. And he's become a martyr for their cause. And he's the 1,000-pound gorilla that's in every room when we hear an anti-gay bill. And I tell you this not so much to criticize them, although it's certainly deserved, but to tell you that that's what I'm up against. And there's not, you can't debate that, right? I thought I'd come up here and have great debates like they did at the original Constitution signing, but you can't. So for example, let's say COVID. So COVID, we all know, requires a balancing of the interests in keeping up with our businesses and our economy with safety for people. And I think we could have a good faith debate about how to do that balancing. How much safety, how much do we have to give to businesses to keep them open and keep the economy going? And that would be a great debate to have. I would bring the value of a human life in the Jewish tradition and why that is such an important principle. But that debate never happens because they don't believe COVID is real. Or they believe it's grossly over-exaggerated and not really an issue that needs to be dealt with. And they believe that just like it's a core belief. And I can't count the number of bills that have are responses to COVID that take the position that COVID is either not real, a hoax, exaggerated, and in some cases QAnon kind of theories like the Jews are behind it, or what's his name, Bill Gates is behind it, stuff like that. That's the extreme. Most of them aren't like that. And there are multiple factions within those 67 Republicans. And part of the trick is to find out which faction can you work with on which kind of thing. And you got to learn to work with these people. And neither of my previous careers was that kind of stark difference so severe like it is now. So I want to share with you another video. So this was last week. We had the budget bill, and the budget bill, the way it happens is there's a budget committee and they propose a bill, and then there's a whole series of amendments that are proposed. Anybody could propose an amendment to either add something or to subtract something. So one thing that we have here is we have a refugee resettlement program, part of the federal program. It's in the city of Missoula. And every year they get 100 or so well-vetted refugees, to resettle there. And the federal government pays the way. But the federal government gives that money to the State Department of Health, which then gives it to the refugees. And there's no, and refugee programs, there's no contribution by the state. It's just a pass-through. The budget they proposed cut out that federal money. In other words, the feds are saying, here, we'll hand you money for this program. And the response in Montana was, no thanks, give it to North Carolina or some other state. So I argued for an amendment that would restore that federal money. And this is just an example of, just a second here. Let me figure out how to do this. This was, hold on. Where am I? Ah! Can you hear me? Probably not.
No, we can hear you.
Quote, you shall love the refugees. As most of you know,
We can hear you.
We can't hear.
Okay, let me try it again. Just give me a second.
Yeah, we
here. I
can
don't-
hear you,
it's the opening note in the song.
and we can see you.
Oh, here we go. Just give me a sec. For some reason, I can't get.
Rewarded by God for doing so. And open any page in the books, in the prophetic books, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Micah, they all teach us.
We can hear it a little bit.
Yeah, I don't know why I can't get it to share.
Not by how much wealth has been acquired, but by
Good.
how we treat the widow and the orphan and the widow. That's God's consistent test of the success of a society.
Huh.
And by the way, Mr. Chair, I hope it's acceptable to you that I
I'm gonna try it one more time.
You can try emailing me the URL and I'll see if I can't get it.
Yeah, well, it's in the middle of a. The problem is it's in the middle of a talk, in the middle of a floor session, and I'm not. So what happens is, for some reason, when I go to share it, it doesn't give me the option of that screen, and I don't know why.
Go ahead and talk. I think everyone will hear you.
Let me see if I can't at least turn up the volume on it so that, oh, it is as loud as it is.
Make sure you see the screen. Put the
Yeah,
screen
that's
right in
what, when
front
I
of
hit
you.
share screen, I don't see it. It goes away.
Go away from the Zoom. Click on that program. So make sure you've got that screen up. Not on Zoom, and then go back to Zoom and share.
Okay, I've got that screen.
Now go back to Zoom and share.
And what happens is the screen goes away. You see me now?
Yeah.
What do you see? Do you see the legislature?
No, a bunch of green plants or something. I don't know.
Oh. Well, I'll play it one more time, and you're just going to have to listen because I can't seem to make it. Let me try one more time. Okay, here we go.
There you are. Just X out of the right-hand corner. And there you go. And
Yeah,
X, or
it doesn't do anything.
try to slide it over.
Here we go.
Okay, good. You got it.
All right, here we go.
Can you turn up the volume?
It's maxed.
Turn up the volume on your computer.
Through symbols and texts, we will reenact the experience of being refugees so that we can feel that experience deeply within our bones.
Good.
Because only then are we fully able to live and implement the Bible's central and most repeated command, quote, you shall love the refugee for you were refugees yourself. As most of you know, Jesus was a refugee. No,
So you got to work in Jesus, right?
Christmas story. In fact, it's the opening note in the song that would become Jesus' life and ministry, where he repeatedly echoes the earlier and oft-repeated command to love the refugee. Ruth, for whom the book of Ruth is named, was a refugee. The Israelite people were refugees, and those who welcomed them, such as Rechav in the book of Judges or Jethro in the book of Exodus, were rewarded by God for doing so. And open any page in the prophetic books, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Micah, they all teach us that a society will ultimately be judged not by how pious people claim to be, not by how much wealth has been acquired, but by how we treat the widow and the orphan and the refugee. That's God's consistent test of the success of a society. And by the way, Mr. Chair, I hope it's acceptable here that I've referenced these historical figures.
That's a little private joke between me and the chair.
America admitted only 18,000 thoroughly vetted refugees who were fleeing persecution, about 100 of whom settled in Missoula. They learn English, they get tutoring, including tutoring and entrepreneurship, and they quickly integrate into the community, helping the local economy. Many of these refugees leave their countries because they've been persecuted for their religious beliefs, such as the Christians from Syria and Iraq. If we really believe in religious freedom, let's live our beliefs by protecting the limited number of people whose lives are literally on the line because of their religious beliefs. Perhaps for some, turning down this federal money to assist these folks for a few months as they resettle might be based on fear, and I understand that. Over the years, I've heard many false and exaggerated claims about refugees that come from a place of fear. But the very reason that the Bible repeats itself so many times in telling us to love the refugee and makes it central to so many of the stories is because fear is a very strong emotion, and we need to be constantly reminded to resist it, to do what justice demands of us. This amendment simply asks us to go beyond fear, to call on our higher selves, our better selves, our godly selves. Members of the body, vote green, please. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And Representative Gott, as always.
Yeah, he said, the chair said at that point, he said, Mr. Representative, God is always welcome in this chamber. So I just have one last video. And then
wait, how did they respond to this?
67-33 against me. Oh, no, I got two Republicans, 65-35. So the last video, and then maybe we'll go to questions, is it was also on the budget, and it involved school lunches. So there's like every state, we have a program that poor kids can get. If you're very poor, you get your lunch for free and breakfast. But if you have a little bit of money, and like if your family earns about $20,000 or so a year, you have to actually, the way this budget read, each kid has to contribute 30 cents a day. And it's sort of like this belief that you won't appreciate it unless you got skin in the game. But of course, the kid doesn't get to control whether the parents are willing to pay. And not only that, the cost of collecting it is almost equal to the 30 cents a day. And so the amendment was to give these kids free lunch. And I didn't really talk Jewish values so much until the very last bit. I mean, specifically Jewish values, because it gets to be an old song. So the very last bit, I kind of mentioned prayer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And let me see if I have to share again to do that. Yeah, here we go.
Stafman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Speak to the amendment, please. Every Thanksgiving our synagogue and local churches partner to volunteer at our local food bank. We spend hours, sometimes days actually, packing bags of food and then many more hours handing those bags out to families in cars in lines that seemingly go on forever. And then once a month, we also with the churches to work at Fork and Spoon, our local restaurant for those who can't afford to eat at a restaurant. And many days, all of our churches and synagogues receive calls from folks who are struggling to get by, often about food. And we can't even come close to meeting the demand to help them all. Now, I share this with you today because if I wasn't frequently actually doing this work, I wouldn't have known the depth and reality of food anxiety in our state or the sheer number of people who live with it. You know, to many of us, these folks are mostly invisible in our communities, but I'm here to tell you that they're real. And to many of us, 30 cents a day, a quarter and a nickel may seem insignificant, but to many of these folks, that's $6 a month that it totals is a meaningful amount of money. You know, the money we collect by demanding this 30 cents a day for lunch after we deduct the cost of collecting it is simply not enough to overcome the realities of and the benefits of making sure kids have enough to eat without stressing a family that may already be living on the edge. You know, as I thought about last night what I wanted to say on this bill, the film Oliver Twist kept on coming to my mind. And particularly the scene where Oliver finishes his food and he's been served and he's still hungry and he dares to ask, "Please, sir, I want some more, please." And the manager of the place, Mr. Bumble, responds, "What? More?" And Oliver is punished. But the most remarkable part of the scene, and you should Google it and watch it, and it's easy to miss, is the bitter irony that when Oliver asks for food, enough food, and is ridiculed for doing so, on the wall in the front of the room, in large letters, a sign reads, "God is love." Friends, this amendment is a very small matter in the scope of our work here today, but it is a defining moment for who we are as a state. This needs to be part of our budget, which is a blueprint of our values. Your vote today is kind of a prayer about the world we desire for our children and ourselves. And our prayers are stronger when we pray them together. Please vote green. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Members of the committee of the whole, I consider all of.
So you're not allowed to mention people by name unless they're historical figures. So what he said before it got cut off is members, I consider Oliver Twist to be a historical figure. So I was okay in mentioning him. But anyway, that went down 65-35 as well. And that's what it's like. You heard my arguments. I picked those two because they're two of the ones where Jewish values played in. I also spoke on an abortion bill and actually quoted from the text from the Hebrew Bible in Hebrew and translated it. But I haven't done that anymore. That was early on because I realized that just is insulting to them. And they believe that a fertilized egg is a full human being, and to try to tell them otherwise is just a waste of time. So that's what I'm up against, and I'm not optimistic, but I am hopeful. And in case you don't know, Jonathan, one of my favorite teachers, Lord Jonathan Sachs, explained the difference between optimism and hope. And he said that optimism is when you feel that things will get better. So I'm not optimistic. But hope is the process of working to make things get better best you can, even if your impact is limited. And there's no Jew worth his salt, says Rabbi Sachs, that doesn't have hope. And that's a motivating thing. One other motivating quote, I'll share this and then we'll go to questions. And that it actually comes from Father Richard Rohr, a Franciscan priest, another one of my teachers, who talked about the intersection of politics and religion. And he says, the problem is that most people begin the process with their political ideas, whatever they might be. And then you try to find how you can make your religion and your religious values fit inside the parameters of those religious ideas. And he says, but what if we did it another way? What if we started by going deep inside and getting in touch with that piece of you that's connected to the Holy One, and let it come purely from there to inform how we end up on the political side? And that's a really challenging thing to do because our political beliefs are so wedded to our way of thinking. But I've been doing my best to try to shed those and to come from that place inside that and let that inform where I end up. As it happens, I end up with the Democrats 99% of the time, but so maybe I'm not successful at it, or maybe that's just the way it is. So with that, I've spoken enough. Why don't I stop and people can ask questions or comments or whatever.
I have a question, and then I'll shut up and we'll let other people. First of all, I'm so proud to know you. Okay, I'm honored to be your friend. I wish that we had more time to spend together, and that we didn't live thousands of miles away. But I'm really proud to know you. I really, and I think I speak not only for myself, but many people on this call as well. So my question really have you run into people that really are QAnon type of people in that legislature? So tell us what's going on with them.
Well, nobody has identified themselves as QAnon, but there's a fringe. I'm going to say a dozen or so Republicans who put forth the QAnon kind of ideology, that they get this stuff from the wild corners of the internet. And I mean, just today on those vaccine bills, for example, these people, the two sponsors, both of them spew this conspiracy theory stuff about vaccines. And then you have and as I said, if they have a high school education, I'm surprised. And then you get like the head of the American Academy of Pediatrics say that's not true. It doesn't cause autism, and what they claim to cause is SIDS also. And they'll come in and they'll say, well, we have 47 studies now that are assembled by the CDC, and there's no association between SIDS and vaccines. But these people will spew it off as if it's gospel. And that's one of the QAnon theories about vaccines. So nobody ever cites QAnon specifically that I've known, but there are plenty of those QAnon theories that are put forth all the time, and it's mainly the same dozen or so people. But then there's a lot of passive people who go along with them. And at first, when I was asked, I said I haven't encountered any anti-Semitism, but it's hard to know when you're facing anti-Semitism. I did have one incident. We have a rule in the committee that if your phone goes off during the committee, you've got to buy donuts the next day. And sure enough, my phone went off one day. And one of the committee members said at the very end, "Hey, Representative Stafman's phone went off. I just want to make a note that he needs to buy the donuts tomorrow." And then this one representative who sits right across from me said, "Yeah, and make sure they have bacon."
Yeah, I was going to ask you if there've been like
actually Rabbi Lori Franklin happened to be watching that session and saw that, because everything is broadcast live. And she texts me and says, "At 6:30 tomorrow, be at Van's Donut Shop. I've ordered you 2 dozen bagel. It's the only donut shop that has bacon donuts." And so I brought them in the next day. And I announced, I just wanted everyone to know that I brought the donuts this morning. And for Representative Gillette, I made sure that they were, and I gave her a look. I made sure that they had bacon. And I hope that I embarrassed them, but I'm not sure that any of them actually got it. I think some did. So that was maybe the only directly anti-Semitic thing that's happened. But there are definitely a few anti-Semites there. And the irony is some of them have Jewish roots. One in particular, the one who I feel is, it's, you know, it's hard to separate anti-Semitism from white supremacy. Experts on the two have said that anti-Semitism is the theology of white supremacy. And so when you see white supremacy, there is an anti-Semitic streak that's very closely aligned, but it's not always obvious. And I've seen lots of quite overt white supremacy. Yeah. So it's sad. I didn't think, I'm the sort of person that doesn't want to see anti-Semitism unless it slaps me in the face. And I've been trying to avoid seeing it, but some of it is definitely there. And I'm not always sure in my own mind when I'm seeing it and when I'm interpreting.
Kate, you have a question. Kate Weinberg. You have to unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you. My husband and I spent a year in Montana on the Blackfoot Indian Reservation as VISTA volunteers and really saw a lot of, just horrendous things done to the Native Americans. I mean, one, just putting them on a reservation, just being on a reservation, but what was done to the children, what was done to food stamp programs, tons of domestic abuse, lots of alcoholism. Okay, it goes on, I think, on many reservations. So my question goes back to, with the immigrants and not getting federal funds for this immigration resettlement in Missoula, what is being done now with Native Americans in the state? That's my first question. My second question is, what keeps you going? I'm so impressed with the work that you do. Whoa, I know Montana, it's tough. So
Yeah.
that's my two questions.
So of the 33 Democrats in our caucus, there are 7 Native Americans. So they're a significant part of the caucus. And I very much identify with them because I think their experience is very close to the Jewish experience. A little different in that, it's, for us, it's mainly before we got to America. For them, it's in America. And there are certainly differences, but there's a lot of similarities. And it's interesting because I came from Florida 15 years ago or so. And in Florida, the minority group, the largest minority group who usually sees the brunt of the hatred are African Americans. And while there are some Native Americans, it's a relatively small group. But here, there's no African Americans. And Native Americans are the principal targeted group here. And everything you said about them is right. I did run a bill called the Montana Racial Justice Act. And it's meant to address disparities in the court system that are mostly about Native Americans. And the Native American caucus all signed on as co-sponsors. It got tabled almost immediately. And so now I'm running it again as a study bill. So it'll go to what's called an interim committee to actually examine it. But the statistics in there that are cited in my bill are astounding in terms of, they represent, I think, 7% of the population and 30% of the prison system. And on and on. And so I very much identify with that group of people. But they're also, understandably, some of them are suspicious of anybody wanting to be part of them. So one of the real challenges is, whether it's with Native Americans or with the right-wingers, is building relationships of trust. And there's not enough time to do that. Especially this year, because for the first half of the session, January and most of February, I was participating on Zoom because they won't wear masks. And until I was fully vaccinated, I wouldn't go live. And so that made it really hard to make the kind of friendships you need. And you know, my intention is so the session is only 4 months. It ends around the end of April. And then there's an interim period for the next year and a half where it's a month committee dives into issues, but it's really in that time. And my intention is to use some of that time to try and go to these people's homes and visit them and not talk politics, but just talk what are tell me about your children. Be a rabbi, right? So on Thursday mornings at 6:30 there's Bible study. So I went. I unfortunately they won't wear masks and they didn't do Zoom, so I couldn't go until about 3 weeks ago. And I went, and it's led by a conservative Christian minister who alternates with this guy who's a senator who teaches his Sunday school class. And the first time I went, his theme was how the Old Testament establishes private property rights. And I just listened patiently to, his theory about, how when it says in the do not steal, really what it's saying is that there are private property rights that are above everything else. And it was a version of the Torah that I had never heard. But it turns out there's this whole prosperity gospel that teaches this kind of stuff. And so not only am I the only Jew who goes to Bible study, but there are no progressive Christians either. It's all these very, very far right wing. And so I see this as fertile ground for friendships. And I have made friends with that particular guy that senator who brought that theory. We went to dinner and I brought my Rashi and I told him what Rashi had to say about that verse. And he was very interested to hear. And we're working on a couple of bills together now. I'm not sure it's going to go anywhere, but it's a start. And they've asked me to be the guest teacher in 2 weeks to teach the Jewish roots of Pentecost, which of course are Shavuot in the Jewish tradition. So it's a process. And so the person who sits right next to me in Bible study is the lieutenant governor. So we got talking after Bible study last week about gender issues. And I said, we should have a private study, just you and me, on what the Bible has to say about gender. And so we did, in fact, just yesterday. And I promised her clergy privilege, so I can't talk about what we said, because I wanted her to be safe and not feel like I'm going to go blab back to the. Everyone's suspicious of everybody. You don't trust anybody there, right? Mm-hmm. It's like the Middle East. Your best friend could be your worst enemy the next minute, and vice versa. So we talked about her views on gender in the Bible, and I think I'm safe to say that when I've shared with these Christians the view of Rashi about Genesis 1:27, where it says God created them, man and woman, He created them, and of course the Jewish view is that was an androgynous being that was half male, half woman, and they were connected. They were facing in opposite directions, and it's not until chapter 2 when God takes the side and creates a separate man and woman. And when these Christians hear that the first being, Adam, was that wasn't his name, but he was made from the earth, Adamah, and that he was androgynous, they think I'm making it up. They don't believe me. So I have to bring texts. I've been Rosh Rabbah, and I show them, this is from like the 2nd century, it was like same time as the Gospels. You got to check this out. They don't believe me. They think it's like, I photoshopped it or something. So it's very interesting, but it's a different world.
Yeah.
Eric, you had a question, and then Raymond.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Rabbi, Representative. Are there members of the Republican caucus who believe in science but don't vote that way because they want to get reelected?
Well, I don't know why people vote how they do, but yeah, there's not that many. And they believe in science when they want to believe in science. So for example, when they had the personhood bill, that a fertilized egg is a person, they say all they want to talk about is DNA and how, it's the DNA is there it's fully there and it's science. We're not arguing anything other than science. But when it comes to wearing a mask, they're not too interested in science. So like everything else in politics, it's pretty much predetermined. And then whether the science or not becomes just a justification for what you want to do politically. There's very little sincere debate. Almost nobody changes their mind about anything. Now, I should say that, we consider a lot of bills, and probably 3/4 of them we all agree on. And they're usually small changes that are just common sense kind of things. But the ones we disagree on are the ones you all hear about, and they're the ones that are, usually go on party lines, and nobody's changing anybody's mind on anything. I mean, you might change 1 or 2 votes, but we've only had less than 10 votes all session out of hundreds that came down to just a few votes difference between, 50, within the 45-55 margin. There's probably maybe only 5, I would guess. And so, yes, it's very politicized, and you vote with your team. Now, that said, I'll give you an example of how we were able to use that one time. So they had a bill that would change, our judges are elected on a nonpartisan basis. And that's a good thing. Judges should not be partisans. So they had a bill that changed all judges to partisan elections. The Republican caucus was split on it. The conservatives wanted that version where all judges became partisan, but the more moderates thought that should be true for the Supreme Court, but not for local judges. And so what happened is the original bill had both of those on there, both judges. And it was not let me see, how did this work? No, sorry. The original bill only had the Supreme Court judges becoming partisan. And the far right people had an amendment to add the district court judges, the local judges. We voted with them on that amendment. It was a risky thing, but we knew that if it was amended in that way, that the moderate Republicans would not accept it and would kill the whole bill, and we killed the whole bill. So we voted with the far right people on the amendment, but we voted with the moderates on the bill as a strategy to kill the bill. It was by like 2 votes, so it was really dicey. And there's always a question of whether to amend a bad bill. Is it good to make it a little better or not, or what's going to be the effect? So it's, it's a very tricky world, this politics, and when you're new to it, it's even trickier because there's a lot of shenanigans that goes on, to say the least.
Do you think the legislature generally reflects the mood of the people of Montana?
No, not at all. It's a citizen legislature, so these are not are not necessarily representative people. I mean, there's one woman who, a freshman like me, she's 19 years old. She graduated high school last June, and her job is she's a nanny. There's another guy who graduated a year and a half ago from high school, and he works as a liquor store clerk. They say that your brain isn't even fully developed until you're 25, and they're making law. And you can't really have a serious philosophical conversation with them, right? I mean, there are a lot of people that do represent their districts. I feel like I represent my district where I live. But I think most of it goes unnoticed by people, and they don't know what their representative is really doing.
Wow.
I should say also that there's a lot of time we spend on turf battles. So bills that, for example, there are some, there are dentists, there are dental hygienists, and then there are some dental hygienists that have a higher degree of training than most. And presently, they're allowed to practice independently in underserved areas like reservations and some schools where they just don't have access to dentists. And the dentists don't like that, though. They don't want these, they think these people have no business practicing independently. And so there's always a bill to resolve that turf. The dentists want us to say they can't, that the hygienists can't do that. The hygienist wants to say we're serving an underserved population, and we have to sort out the turf wars. And there's a million of them. The archery hunters and the crossbow hunters, the pharmacies and the doctors. They're just so many groups can't work out their differences, and then they use their power by knowing legislators to run bills to try and tilt the playing field in their way. So these are some of the things I've learned, that I wasn't expecting. I had no idea that I'd be the judge between the dentists and the dental hygienists.
Raymond, you're up.
Raymond Capilouto, how are you, buddy?
Hello, old friend. I'm fine. Wendy and I are fine. Hope Beth.
Wendy, good to see you.
Nice to see you.
So first a comment, and this should come as no surprise to the folks on this call. Many years ago, many years ago, Ed Stafman was a great temple president. Let me tell you, he was. Ed, a question, two questions. To what extent do the state courts have any power to restrain the legislature?
So that's an interesting question. They have a lot of power, obviously. They can declare some of these kind of things unconstitutional. They can interpret them. But one of the things that's been happening this session is a very sustained attack on the independence of the judiciary. There's been a lot of bills. So one of them, for example, right now, if there's a Supreme Court opening, there's an election. But this bill changed. If there's a midterm opening, there's a judicial nominating commission, which nominates 3 people to the governor based on their qualifications. We've just eliminated that judicial nominating commission that's been in place for 50 years, so that the governor gets to make purely political appointments. There's the partisan bill that failed, but there's this commission they're trying to set up that I don't know if it'll pass, but would oversee judges, 7 lay people appointed by the governor, and they could say, "Oh, you interpreted this law incorrectly, in our opinion, and therefore we're recommending impeachment." The judges are terrified. All the judges associations came in today to testify against that bill. It's actually called an inquisitor bill, and the judges are calling it the judicial inquisition. It's probably going to pass. But judges would then become the only profession in the state that's regulated by a board that has no judges on it. In other words, the dental board has dentists on it, the electricians board has electricians on it. This would be the first board that, and believe me, so we have a governor who, let me just tell you, our governor was, first of all, he's famous because he beat up a Jewish reporter when he ran for governor last time. But he's the founder of a creationist museum in Montana, where you can go see Noah's Ark and dinosaurs that walked around with people 5,600 years ago. One of his good friends is the Chabad rabbi, actually. They see the world the same way. And by the way, when I've tried to bring up rabbinic teachings, the Chabad rabbi has called people on the committee to tell them I'm wrong. So that's another challenge and then committee members will tell me, well, you say that's a Jewish view, but I know there are other Jewish views. And so he's done everything he can to undermine me. So there's this. So the judges have power, but they're also well aware of the politics of the attacks on their authority. And how many of those attacks will stick, I don't know. You know, whether this commission will get created or some of these other limitations. But they also are cognizant of, if they don't, that this is hanging over their head. And if they appear to be too far off of what the legislature wants, in 2 years it's going to come back and they're going to enact it. So there's a major assault on. We saw this in the federal system too. I mean, there's always been politics in judicial appointments. That's nothing new. But we've never had anything quite as radical as we saw in the last presidential administration of people who the ABA declared incompetent, people who had to come from this particular judicial society, and people who were consistently inexperienced and very young. And of course, then there's the whole issue that happened when Merrick Garland couldn't even get a hearing, but they managed to confirm the last one in 2 weeks. So the politicization of the judiciary is happening at the federal level. And a lot of what's happened in the Trump administration has given license to these folks. By the way, almost all of the Republicans believe that Trump won the election. And they've said that repeatedly, and that it was stolen. I say almost all, a clear majority. And so that's another reality we're dealing with. And we've entered a world of politics, and it had been sort of ratcheting up this way for a long time, I think, but it became like solidified under Trump, where the means always justify, the ends always justifies the means. And in fact, I was on the elevator today with one of the moderate Republicans who was complaining about some of the right-wing Republicans. And I say, hey, I know you're a good guy. I know you're not one of them. And he says, thank you so much. He says, they only have one interest. They don't care about policy. They just want to own the libs. And that's what it's about. It's about partisan warfare. And how can they be disrespectful? How can they, you know, beat the libs? And so many, they ran on issues of jobs and the economy, which I always said, hey, I'd love to work with you on that. I bet you we could do a ton of stuff on jobs and the economy. But there's almost no legislation on jobs and the economy. It's all about hating trans kids, hating LGBT people, anti-abortion, attacks on the judges, the attacks on public health, attacks on vaccines, attacks on the United States, on Biden and the federal government. So, you know, they run on one issue, but they legislate on something else.
Sure, because the issue now, their strategy is to create a culture war.
They're not created; it already exists.
Right, because on the other issues, federally, there's too much being done.
Well, I have to say, you know, not a single Republican voted for the American, whatever it's called, the Biden's Relief Act that just got passed. Mm-hmm. And yet they're thrilled to have that money and spend it.
Yeah.
You know?
Reb Pulaski, you had a question. Jerry, you have to unmute.
Okay, got me?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Just two quick questions. One is, how did you find a district that would vote in your community that would vote for a rabbi to be elected? How did you get elected? What was unique about your district that would vote you in? And the second is, certainly you have a physician who's in charge of health and human services who talks about the pandemic, that it's real. And how does your governor deal with somebody, a physician who's giving those facts?
Two great questions. Let me start with the second one. The physician, who happened to be a member of my congregation, just resigned.
Yeah.
For, you know, publicly, the explanation is simply, you know, I have more time with my family or whatever. But you know, he didn't want to stay in administration that denies science. I'm sure. I have no authority to speak for him, but that would be my guess. And he's appointed his own people, many of whom are worked for the Trump administration in Washington. And so I don't know what it, you know, it's only been a couple of months. We haven't really seen how that's going to play out. The first question is, you know, so the district I ran in is the district I live in. So keep in mind that Montana is like a lot of states in that there are blue strongholds in red seas. And Bozeman, where I live, and Missoula are the two big universities. Actually, part of the university is in my district, a small part, and the rest adjoins my district. And they're very progressive places. Bozeman is, I would say, you know, one of the most progressive places in the country. So is Missoula. So and where Allen is up in Whitefish is a little bit, I would describe it as sort of a 50-50 kind of place. Depends, you know, how far you get out. And then Billings, which is the largest city in the state, is about a 40-60 progressive state situation. But then it's the rest of the state that's red is red. And a lot of these legislators come from those towns, and that's their only life experience. And so one guy who's the nicest guy, he builds fences for a living, and in a small town, and he's had no experience. Coming to Helena, which is a couple hours away, is about as far a journey as he's ever made. And that's the life experience he brings. And you know, he told me before the session that his big issue is getting prayer back in schools. And when I said, well, I like prayer, but how are you going to control for people of different religious beliefs? He says, what do you mean? There's a Christian country. We're founded as a Christian country. It's going to be Christian prayer. And there's no sense in, I mean, that's what he deeply believes. And so anyway, in my district, it's a progressive district. The biggest challenge I had is, you know, I had to put up yard signs. It's kind of the custom around here. And I didn't know, a lot of people will identify themselves as Allen, you know, and then maybe Allen in big letters and Setcher in little letters, or they might say Setcher in big letters and Allen in little letters. It depends what your first name is. If you have a catchy first name, you know, it might be a better, like if you're a Raymond Capelluto, I'd definitely use Raymond. You know, with an exclamation mark or something like. Well, I had the challenge because I'm so well known as Rabbi Ed, and very few people know my last name, but they all know Rabbi Ed because I had a newspaper column. I was very active in all sorts of interfaith settings. There's hardly a church in Bozeman I haven't taught at one time or another. Everybody knows Rabbi Ed, and the question was, would I run as Rabbi Ed on my yard signs and so on, or would I run as Ed Stafman? It was a really difficult question. But I realized that on the ballot, it's not going to say Rabbi Ed, it's going to say Ed Stafman. And I had to get people used to my name. And that was the reason, that was ultimately what tipped the scales there. And then when I got elected, the question was, in various capacities, would I be representative rabbi? And I explained that, you know, a rabbi is how you refer to a rabbi. It's just, or reb or some other indication. It's just normal. Just like you would never refer to a priest as anything other than Father so-and-so. Ministers, Protestant ministers are different. They're often called by their first name. It's the reverend title is, in church you would use it, but outside of church, not necessarily. And I just asked casually what they, you know, so you have a name tag and you're identified in all sorts of ways officially. And I asked casually, you know, would I be of one of the staff people, would I be, and it totally freaked them out. And they sought a legal opinion on it. I didn't know I set off a firestorm like that. And the legal opinion came back and said I could not be known as rabbi. But the truth is, there are people on the floor who call me rabbi, and others who don't.
Yeah.
So, but that was a little interesting thing also. So there's so much new stuff here. I feel like I'm starting school all over again.
So what is the picture behind you? The battle?
You know, maybe Ina knows. It's a very famous painting from a century ago that's been in the House chambers ever since Montana has been a state. And if you went onto the Montana legislature website, I'm sure you can read about it because it's a well-known painting. But I don't recall precisely what it depicts. I've wondered though about how the Native Americans feel about it. I've never asked them. I'm excited. My friend Windy Boy has invited me to a sweat when the session's over, and I'm looking forward to that. Windy Boy he's been around longer than any of them, and he speaks his mind, and he's very, very he's totally dedicated to his people.
Mm-hmm.
And,
aside, yeah, I just we'll just end up with this. But aside from the Democratic Republican issue, don't you think that what we're representing now is Elliot Dorff actually wrote an article about this? Is that there really is a lack of congruence between American and Jewish values right now? Do you see it that way?
Well, I guess you have to start by saying what are Jewish values, because you and I would agree, but I don't think we would agree with the Chabad rabbi,
mm-hmm.
right? So, and we see that playing out in Israel in even a bigger way.
Sure.
Right? So you have to start there, I think. But if you're talking about progressive Jewish values, yeah, of course. And what I see is the issue that came up in that Bible study with this question of rights. And Judaism, when we came to Sinai, God didn't give us a Bill of Rights. He gave us 613 commandments. And they're all about responsibilities, about what are our obligations and how we treat one another, how we treat the earth. And all of Jewish values, as I see them, even if you want to look halachically, are about what are our responsibilities to one another in the earth. There's no rights in there. We have no entitlement to anything. What does Kohelet, the book of Ecclesiastes, teach us? It's you're passing through. You're on your way. You have no entitlement to anything. And and the earth is mine, it says in Tehillim and Psalms. And so, I start from there as sort of basic Jewish value principles, and they start from the Enlightenment and from Locke, who is all about rights, and responsibilities come secondarily, and they then project that back to the Bible. So they take and they talk all the time about God-given rights, and I'm so tempted to say, can you show me where these rights are in the Bible? Because God didn't give us any rights. God gave us only responsibility. And I think that's the basic conflict. I have Orthodox friends in Israel too, who would agree with me on that. Now they may disagree on what the particular responsibilities are, but that this rights versus responsibilities thing is a really core issue. And what's happened though, since John Locke, is this the rights thing has turned into a very absolutist kind of ideology. So John Locke didn't say you have no, John Locke was one of these, your rights, you have a right to swing your fist, which ends at my nose. But it doesn't end at my nose for these modern day libertarian / Republicans. Yeah. You have the right to do whatever the hell you want, and they don't even see the possibility that there's a responsibility on the other end. Yeah. And the masks is like a classic example of that.
Yeah. So Rabbi Koren put it up on a Google Drive, a Pesach commentary from Professor Elliot Dorff, who you and I know from is one of the great philosophers, living philosophers of the American Jewish University and conservative Judaism, about contrasting American and Jewish values. And his main point is that he's contrasting individualism with communitarianism, or being communal, the communal focus in Judaism. The article came out as a commentary for Pesach. For some reason, I could not find it online, but it's worth folks to click on that and take a look at it. And I'll probably contact Professor Dorff sometime later this week because I think it's a wonderful article that's very enlightening on that some of the times our values are not the same. He ends up by saying one has to find a balance, which is fine, but I think that that we really do see a difference now. So anyway, Ed, I just cannot thank you enough. It's wonderful to see you again. I know that Ina and Alan are so proud to be to at least have somebody in Montana they can cheer for. You know, so
Oh, I do a lot of cheering for them.
yeah, and I wanted to thank both Alan. I wanted to thank Rabbi Setcher. I wanted to thank you again for last night, and Rabbi Stafman. Thank you so much for sharing with us. All I can tell the people in Greensboro, I'm retiring on at the end of June, and I have no intention of running for public office.
Well, you ought to think about it. You know what happened? I retired. I became Rabbi Emeritus 2 years ago. And I went ahead and I changed all of the light switches in my house to smart switches and finished all the other projects that had been accumulating over the years that I never had time for. And then the question became, what am I going to do next? And, you know, as you know, you don't retire from something, you retire to something.
Yeah.
And the seat by district became open. And I thought, well, as a rabbi and as a lawyer, wouldn't I be well suited? Little did I know those skills would have no use. But it was, you know, the question is always, what, you know, how do you serve? As a rabbi, you serve. And I would imagine that the majority of the people on this call in some way or another serve. And the question when you retire is not what will I do next, but how will I serve next? And if you've got the chutzpah for it, I think serving in this way is a really great way to serve. And it's, you'll learn a lot, and you'll I think about it.
Okay, I'm thinking about my grand
association of rabbi legislators. There's a Jewish Legislators Association, which I joined. There's quite a few Jewish legislators around the country, but I'm the only rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi Stafman. Anybody wants to unmute themselves and say a personal thank you to him, please do so. And Ed, it was just wonderful to see you again. And
making an impact. You are.
Yeah, definitely you're making an impact. Kol hakavod, yashar koach, keep up your good work. Every little success you have makes a bigger difference than you think.
Good to see you all.